Donald Trump were the 2024 nominee, would you support him?
I would not.
Okay. Liz Cheney, very good catching up with you.
Wow, it's a simple response seems to be so shocking that the host is speechless. Congresswoman Liz Cheney with that very succinct response yesterday. It's not hard. She has emerged as one of the former president's top targets after she voted for his impeachment. Meanwhile, new polling gives President Joe Biden a solid job approval rating just about 2 weeks away from his 100th day in office. In the latest Quinnipiac University poll, 48% approve of the president's job performance, 42% disapprove, while the latest Monmouth University poll shows Biden with a 54% approval rating, edge over 41% disapproval. When looking at the issues, the Quinnipiac poll finds that 64% approve of the president's handling of the coronavirus, 29% disapprove. On the economy, 50% approve, 42% disapprove. On taxes, 45% approve, 42% disapprove. And on the situation at the southern border, just 29% approve of the president's handling, 55% disapprove. Willie.
New polling also shows a plurality of Americans backing President Biden's infrastructure plan, and support grew even more if it's funded by raising taxes on corporations in the poll. In the latest Quinnipiac University poll, 44% support the $2 trillion plan, while 38% oppose it. When adding a corporate tax rate to fund it, support rose by 9 points to 53%, while 39% oppose the plan. Joining us now, White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and MSNBC contributor, Yamiche Alcindor, former senior advisor for the House Oversight Committee, now a columnist for USA Today and the LA Times, Kurt Bardella, and co-founder of Punchbowl News, Jake Sherman. He is an MSNBC political contributor. So fascinating there in that polling, Jake, when you look at the corporate tax rate is what Republicans are hanging their hat on. They say, we're not going to vote for a bill that raises taxes. Well, Americans, when they hear the details of we're going to raise taxes 7% potentially on big companies to pay for all this stuff that you say you like within the bill, support for it actually goes up. Does that take something away from the Republican criticism of this proposed plan?
It should, Willie. Two things to point out here. Number one, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with the White House and administration officials where they say to me that they believe soaking the rich and corporate tax increases are popular. They believe that most Americans think that tax increases on corporations are very popular, and they believe that most Americans think corporations actually skirt taxes. So that's why they're paying for this large-scale bill with tax increases on corporations. That's number one. Number two, does this change the calculus of Senate Democrats who are against this? Because forget Republicans. They're probably not going to participate in this bill anyway. But does this move Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema? Joe Manchin has said time and time again, nothing happens without his approval. So if he's for 25%, maybe they have to move there. The only question that matters, Willie, is what does Joe Manchin and what does Kyrsten Sinema do? Everything else is relatively academic at this point. And that the question is, can you find a sweet spot that's going to get 50 votes under the fast track process that somewhere in that 25 to 28 range? I don't think it's going to be 28. I think it'll be closer to 25.
Yeah, and Yamiche, the White House has not just suggested, they've said explicitly we're willing to negotiate on that number for the corporate tax rate. They do point out that when Donald Trump came into office, the corporate tax rate was 35%. His legislation moved it in 2018 down to 21%, so they're just looking to bring it back somewhere in the middle, not going all the way back to the pre-Trump corporate tax rate. But is it your sense that there are negotiations happening right now between the White House and senators like Joe Manchin to bring that number down from 28?
It is my sense that the White House is talking to senators, especially Joe Manchin, to really try to get at what rate will be the one that can be passed in the Senate. You hear from White House officials, from the president himself, as well as the Commerce Secretary, as well as the White House Press Secretary. This is a bill that they've been very open about wanting to negotiate, especially on that 28% corporate tax rate. And when you push the White House specifically and say, well, Joe Manchin says he wants 25%, they don't shrug their shoulders and say, say, well, we can't give Joe Manchin what he wants. They say, okay, well, that might be the number that we end up at. So this is really an ongoing discussion, but they're very, very open to speaking with Senator Manchin and making sure that he's on board because they, of course, need him. The other thing to note here is that I think that polling that you just put up, it really underscores the White House's message, which is that if Republicans in the Senate and in the House won't get on board, we'll just go directly to their voters. And that means that they're looking at not the entire Republican base, but some Republican voters, as well as some local Republican officials, to be able to have support for this bill, to say, well, it's still bipartisan across the nation. That, of course, was the playbook with the COVID-19 relief bill that was passed. That seems to, again, be the playbook here. I will tell you that I have been talking to a number of White House officials and some senators who say it does not look good to have a second big $2.25 trillion bill go through without any support from Republicans, but they might not have a choice. They definitely want to look like they are trying to have bipartisan support. They want to try to get some Republicans on board. But like Jake said, it just does not look like that's actually going to happen. But they really do want to continue to do that because 2022 is just around the corner. And Republicans, if a second bill goes through with only Democrats voting for it, Republicans are going to be able to say these are two huge bills that they did not take our input in.
Yeah, Mike, if you look at that polling on the corporate tax rate, you have a bunch of Americans saying, yeah, if you want to make Amazon pay a few tax dollars so that you can fix our bridges and roads and get us broadband and get us green energy and all the rest of it, go for it.
Yeah, really, I mean, if you're the Democrats and you're looking at the tax structure, especially the corporate tax structure, and how to sell this to people, the $1 trillion cost of infrastructure, and you're saying, well, they took the corporate tax rate, they knocked it down from 35% to, 21%. Do you think people would be liking it if we raised it again to 25 or 26% so that they wouldn't have to pay as much? I think you'd probably see the Democrats sitting around a table saying, I think we have a winner. But Kurt Bardella, let's talk about your old party here, for example, in this whole thing, this construct about who's going to pay for what. So we have a political party that's saying no to almost everything in both sides of the House, the Senate and the House. Republicans saying no to almost everything that's being proposed, not voting for anything the Democrats are trying to pass. So going forward into the election year, the off-year election year, you've got a government, the Biden administration, seemingly proving each and every day that government, when it's run efficiently, works. People are getting vaccines. People are getting money to help stem them through the horrendous losses that they've suffered over the past 14 months or so. What is the future of a political party, the Republican Party, that is basically going to go to the country right now, philosophically, next year, and saying, here's our position, no?
Well, Mike, the future for this party is one that's going to rapidly find itself losing elections with more regularity. You can't beat something with nothing. If what you're offering the American people is just an ongoing diet of no, while the other party is able to march out a litany of successes, a litany of goals that there is overwhelming support from American people on both sides of the aisle, that is an untenable situation. The problem for the Republican Party right now is the things that they're saying no to, there's some popularity within their own party for. And when you go back to your district and you campaign and ask to get reelected, how are you going to look voters in the face and say, keep voting for me? I opposed that bridge that got fixed that you like. I opposed that freeway extension that was paid for by stimulus dollars that I voted no on. Who helped you get through COVID-19, but it turns out I've been espousing anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. The list goes on and on of policies that have shown time and again are resonating with the American people. And Republicans are looking very, very dangerously close to looking out of touch with where their own voters and constituents are. At the end of the day, nobody come November of 2022 is going to care or remember whether a bill was completely Democrat or completely Republican. They're going to know whether it worked, whether there were results in their backyards, in their communities, in their economies. If the results are there, if the financial spigot that's being turned on works for average Americans working in this country, they're going to like it. And it won't matter what the roll call vote was. Republicans don't want to risk being on the wrong side of that. I think they're really overplaying their hand by saying no to everything.
So at the top of the hour, to President Joe Biden's announcement yesterday that it is, quote, time for American troops to come home from Afghanistan.
We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the 4th United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th. We went to Afghanistan because of a horrific attack that happened 20 years ago. That cannot explain why we should remain there in 2021. Rather than return to war with the Taliban, we have to focus on the challenges that are in front of us.
The president made a strong, clear argument in his words and gestures about this decision yesterday. And joining us today from the White House, President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Thanks so much for joining us. I guess my first question to you will be, what will you say to the critics when the first thing goes wrong upon the troops' departure? Because there will be challenges ahead in the future.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. What we'll say is that the United States put 20 years of investment into Afghanistan to achieve a clear objective, which was to get the people who attacked us on 9/11. And after 10 years, we got bin Laden. And it has been 10 years since then. Al-Qaeda is degraded. The terrorist threat is reduced substantially in Afghanistan, and we believe that we can accomplish our counterterrorism mission with forces from outside Afghanistan, not keeping a permanent military presence in the country. And we believe that we have trained up 300,000 Afghan national security forces to take responsibility for their own country. We will continue to support them diplomatically and economically, but it is time now for the Afghan people to take responsibility for Afghanistan.
Jake, thanks so much for being with us this morning. The New York Times reported several weeks ago about the rise of ISIS in Afghanistan, not just Taliban expanding throughout the country, but also now a concern about the rise of ISIS in Afghanistan. Is that a concern that you and the president share?
We are concerned about both ISIS and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We judge today that the level of threat from ISIS in Afghanistan, the level of threat from the ISIS and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is substantially reduced to the point where they cannot present today a direct threat against the homeland. However, there is always the possibility that that threat grows. And so we will keep our attention on Afghanistan for that reason. We will keep capabilities in the region to deal with that, and we will hold the Taliban to its commitments to not let Afghanistan be a base for attacks against the West. But Joe, a key point here is that the terrorist threat has become much more dispersed and distributed since we went to Afghanistan 20 years ago. ISIS is still in Iraq and Syria. ISIS is in Africa. Al-Qaeda is in Yemen and Syria and Somalia. So we need a force posture to deal with this terrorism threat that isn't all focused on a garrison in a single country.
Well, it's been dispersed. Could you not make the argument it's been dispersed in part because we have had a presence in Afghanistan?
Well, if the argument that our presence in Afghanistan has led to the rise of ISIS and al-Qaeda in multiple other parts of the world, I'm not sure that's a good argument to remain. But what I would argue is that the conditions have changed dramatically across multiple countries and multiple continents because it's been 2 decades since we went. The world of 2021 is much different from the world of 2001. And we need to set up our foreign policy and our counterterrorism policy to focus on the next 20 years, not the last 20 years.
The president has said that there have been 4 presidents over 20 years that have dealt with troops in Afghanistan. I believe there have been 14 presidents over 72 years that have been in charge of troops that are in Korea, in another hot zone. What's the difference between those two? Are there not times where troops need to remain in countries because of the dangers that are posed by those countries?
Yes, and the Biden administration supports America's force posture in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world to defend our national security interests and defend our allies. But the big difference between Germany and Korea on the one hand and Afghanistan on the other hand is that we are not under fire at bases in Germany and Korea. We are not facing the possibility of being back at war with an armed military force on a daily basis, taking casualties, losing lives. We are able to sustain those presences at the request of the government and in conditions that allow us to both achieve our objectives and protect our troops. And the president judged that after May 1st, after the deal between the U.S. and the Taliban, the deadline set in that deal arrives, we would have to go back to war with the Taliban for the 21st and 22nd and 23rd year, and he was not prepared to keep American troops in harm's way when he believes that we accomplished what we set out to accomplish going into Afghanistan in 2001.
Jake, it's Willie, guys. Good to have you on the show this morning. What do you say to some of the veterans who I was texting with last night and people we've heard from publicly yesterday who, by the way, are, yes, of course they're happy it's winding down. 20 years of their lives, they've lost their friends. Their lives have been forever changed by the war in Afghanistan. They don't want to be there forever more than anyone. But they just said, as a matter of fact, we'll be back. It may not be me, but somebody, maybe somebody younger than me. We'll have to go back to Afghanistan because it is what it is, and the Taliban will be what it is and was before we ever got there 20 years ago. So what do you say to them who are fully expecting that they'll have to go back to Afghanistan?
Well, the first thing I would say is just to thank them for their incredible service and bravery over the last 20 years. I had the opportunity to join President Biden yesterday when he went to Arlington National Cemetery, and it was an incredibly powerful reminder of their service, their sacrifice, what they put into this. And for 20 years, they stood watch and protected this country in Afghanistan, and for 20 years, Afghanistan was not used as a base for terrorist attacks against this country. We believe that we have developed a strategy that allows us to have the kinds of capabilities and assets we need outside of Afghanistan to suppress the terrorist threat coming from inside Afghanistan. And we believe that with the right level of attention and resources and focus, we can protect this country without sending forces back there. There are always risks, of course, but in the balance of risks between staying at war as it enters its third decade or taking the course that President Biden set out yesterday, we believe that not only honors the troops, it also protects the United States of America.
You may have seen, Jake, that General David Petraeus was very critical yesterday of the decision. He, of course, commanded forces in Afghanistan. He started by saying, of course, I understand the instinct to come home. Nobody wants to come home more than the men and women on the front lines who are fighting the war. But he said, quote, I'm really afraid we're going to look back 2 years from now and regret the decision and wonder if whether we might not have sought to manage it with a modest, sustained commitment that could have ensured al-Qaeda and the Islamic State would not reestablish sanctuaries from which they could attack the United States. What do you say to General Petraeus?
I respect General Petraeus, but I would say this. President Biden made a very powerful argument yesterday that a common theme in the criticism is we should leave Afghanistan at some point, but just not now. Let's wait till the conditions are right. That has been the logic that has kept us in this country for 20 years, 10 years beyond when we got Osama bin Laden. And if the conditions aren't right now, when will they be? 1 year from now? 5 years from now? 10 years from now? Permanently? And if the answer is, as I think General Petraeus is arguing, permanently, then that would, to stay, you would have to accept a level of casualties of American forces killed and wounded on an ongoing basis, decades after we had successfully degraded the threat from al-Qaeda and we had gotten their leader, Osama bin Laden. And that was just not what the president found convincing on a going forward basis. And he believes that we have a way of approaching this terrorist threat, and as we were discussing earlier, the broader metastasized, dispersed, distributed terrorist threat across multiple countries where we're not stationing thousands of troops, and yet we're keeping our eye on the ball to protect our people.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. We appreciate it.
Yes, the placement of the knee is towards the back and the back right side of Mr. Floyd's neck, and the airway is around the front. It is nowhere close to his airway.
We were talking about having an open airway. How does that affect your ability to speak?
The ability to speak or make any other sound, groaning, and Mr. Floyd did groan. So any of the sounds that Mr. Floyd is making requires you to be able to take air in over the vocal cords and out over the vocal cords.
Lawyer and former prosecutor David Henderson also joined the conversation. MSNBC contributor Mike Barnacle and the New York Times Mara Gay is still with us. Mr. Henderson, David, what do you make of the concept of the exhaust pipe potentially contributing to George Floyd's death?
Among the ridiculous things that Dr. Fowler said, I thought that was the most ridiculous. And it was a surprise and not without reason, because I think everyone was rolling their eyes at it. But what you have to remember is the defense is trying to appeal to a potential lone wolf juror who will hang this jury. And that person can't go back and blatantly state what their narrative in this case is. And that is that George Floyd is a big guy who was on drugs, who was a problem. And so what Derek Chauvin did was justified. You can't say that. But you can say, well, we heard from the good Dr. Fowler, who said that Derek Chauvin is not responsible for causing George Floyd's death. That's what this witness was here to do, and he gets paid a lot of money to offer opinions like that.
And it looks as if does it not, that they're really going to causation. They're going to hammer on causation, and they just want to plant that seed of doubt. And like you said, what are those lone jurors' minds to say, oh, it was the exhaust pipe. Oh, wait, he was still using his windpipe because he was groaning and making noises. Oh, he was on drugs. Oh, so that seems to be the logic of that. Could that work? That argument, could that work with that one lone juror?
Well, Joe, you've hit the nail on the head. And what's easy to forget about this case and about all the responses to the case is just how different they've been. Many of us saw what happened to George Floyd, and we took to the streets, we protested, we pushed for change. Other people put up Blue Lives Matter signs in their yards. I have a neighbor who did that, in fact. And so, yes, we didn't really, during jury selection, get to know these jurors well enough to know what they truly think. But if you have someone who is biased in favor of police in general, then yes, the defense's approach, offensive though it is, and I have to stress that, is deeply offensive what they're doing, does have the ability to work because it gives someone like that enough to hang their hat on.
The Washington Post's Eugene Robinson has a recent op-ed entitled, "I Want to Believe Justice is Possible in Derek Chauvin's Trial, but a part of me holds back." He writes in part this: George Floyd's death is fully documented on video recorded from multiple angles. The onlooker's cell phones, the officer's body cameras, a surveillance camera across the street. All the jurors have to do is believe their own eyes and ears. I should be able to expect that they will do so. I should at least be able to hope that they will. But hope still feels dangerous. Here's some of why Gene is so cautious. In 1992, the Los Angeles police officers charged with beating Rodney King were acquitted. In 2013, a Florida jury acquitted George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. In 2016, the trial of South Carolina officer who shot Walter Scott in the back 3 times ended in a mistrial after jurors failed to reach a unanimous verdict. Michael Slager later pleaded guilty. In 2017, also in Minnesota, a jury acquitted the police officer who shot and killed Philando Castillo. And in New York, no charges were ever brought against the officer who put Eric Garner in a deadly chokehold.
Well, and Maura, all we have to do is look at Eric Gardner, who was murdered on the streets of Staten Island. We saw the video. Charges weren't even brought. And then we look at the case of Walter Scott, where he was moving slowly away from the police officer who took out his gun, thinking nobody was watching him, and shot him in the back repeatedly. And that case ended in a mistrial. So there's one example after another example to suggest we need to be looking at this jury and wondering if there's somebody on that jury that is biased and is going to have cause a hung jury, despite the overwhelming evidence that we've seen. This isn't the first time, I guess what I'm saying is, that we've seen such overwhelming evidence.
That's right, Joe. We seem to be extraordinarily invested in the spectacle of Black death in this country. And that goes back a whole long way, unfortunately, to when, there were picnics around lynchings. Now, I see a direct line from that to this ritual that we have now, where we go over and over these killings that don't stop, but yet we seem unable, uninterested, unwilling in doing anything to prevent them as a society. So it's the level of frustration, I think, among Americans who are watching this, who care, and among Black Americans is extraordinary. If you want to understand why people are in the streets, mostly peacefully, this is why. What do we have left but this anger? And I would also say, why are we so invested as a country, as a justice system, in ignoring what is in front of our eyes, ignoring what we see? Who benefits from that? It's certainly not Black Americans. It's not just individual police officers, but it's the system that they represent. And so I think if you're a Black American and you're watching this, I think about young kids watching this, what hope do they have of getting a fair shake? So the lesson learned here for Black Americans is there are no rules to follow. There are no rules to follow that will keep you safe.
And to circle back to what you were saying last hour, I'm wondering how important it is as you talk about still talking about this year after year after year. How important is it that when you look at what policing is like, what you talked about last hour, where we start asking, do we really want police officers to be the ones that are making, three armed people making traffic stops over expired stickers? Do we really want police officers being the ones responsible for policing homelessness and people on park benches across our cities and towns? Maybe there's a more dramatic step back, not just reform and not just training, but taking a more holistic approach on what police officers should be doing and should not be doing in 2021.
That's right, Joe. My frustration is because of these slogans like defund the police, which is just a really, I think, unfortunate slogan all the way around. We've been unable to actually have the real conversation. That's a very rational one about, why it is that we have police officers doing the work in some cases that social workers should be doing, that teachers should be doing, that homeless services can be doing. And if you talk to police officers, which I have in my job many times, they don't want to be doing that work either. So there is actually a whole lot of room for reform that both helps police officers and, importantly, the communities that they serve. And so it starts with accountability, but not just for individual officers, but for the policies and the police chiefs that are actually putting these officers with these weapons in these situations on a clash course with actually the people that they are meant to protect and serve. We need to change that dynamic. Otherwise, we're going to see this again and again. It won't stop.
All right. Thank you so much, Mara Gay. We greatly appreciate you being here. Thank you. And Mike, getting to Mara's point, not just looking at sweeping reforms that she's suggesting, but even looking at what's happening around Minneapolis and what's been happening around Minneapolis over the past couple of weeks. You just look at this video of three officers approaching a car with an expired sticker. 10 miles from where I think the most important trial we've had in quite some time involving race is going on. And you just wonder what the chief of police and what others were thinking. You remember, I guess it was Hill Street Blues, where at the end, when they had the cops together, he said, "Be careful out there." My God, I think somebody should have told the police chief and the leaders of this community, be careful out there. These are perilous times. You can't afford to be in a position where you could make a stupid mistake that could cost the lives of somebody and cause this town to erupt. It really is beyond me. About there's going to be the trial on how you grab a taser and how you're holding a gun thinking it's a taser. There's going to be that trial, all right? But we need to back up and just ask, what the hell was the police chief? What the hell is everybody else thinking when they're bringing 3 armed cops up to the door of a young black man because of an expired sticker?
Well, that's the key question, Joe. Why did they make that stop? A tag on the back of a license plate? I mean, how many people in the country in various states have been stopped for similar things, and the cop walks up to the window, asks for the registration, and tells them you got an expired sticker, hands the registration back, and says, get going and get the inspection sticker taken care of. That's what happens when you're white, not when you're black, clearly. Mm-hmm. And Mara mentioned, and you've been talking about the tape, the highly visible tape that is on trial now. We've got 2 tapes now. We've got the Brooklyn Center tape, and we have obviously the George Floyd tape. And I hearken back to studies that were done after the Rodney King trial. And the jurors had seen the tape so often on TV prior to the trial and as evidence during the trial that they were desensitized to the horrific beating that Rodney King took at the hands of the Los Angeles Police Department. And my feeling is, from covering a lot of trials, a lot of murder trials, and David, I would like your thought on this, your view on this, is that you can measure evidence, you can measure testimony, but you can never measure human nature in the jury pool. And you don't know what they're thinking. And it seems to me, off of yesterday's testimony from the medical examiner from, I forget what state he was from, that the defense obviously is looking for 2 things. They're looking for a hung jury, and they're also looking, maybe they're driving down the manslaughter highway. They're looking for a manslaughter charge out of this, evidently. What's your opinion of this?
Well, there's a saying that if you make them cry in a jury box, they won't cry in the jury room. And that goes to what you're saying about desensitizing jurors to evidence. And so, yes, I think there's always that danger when you watch a video over and over again. At the same time, I've got to be honest with you, I've come home and told my wife, if I have to watch this video again, I'm going to break down. For me, the more I watch it, the more it hurts to see the way they treated him, to see how fearful he was of being killed by police. And for anyone who thinks that's unreasonable, tell that to Philando Castile. Because when Eugene listed off the cases that caused him to have doubt, remember, there have been 3 killings, wrongful killings of black people in the Minneapolis area in the past 5 years. Philando Castile, George Floyd, now Dante Wright. And so I think what this video probably truly does is further cement what people are already feeling. For those of us who are sympathetic and who appreciate what's going on, it hurts. But for people who are resistant, who want to defend police, I think it has the opposite effect. And that goes towards them trying to seek a hung jury. A hung jury, there's still hope. You can retry Derek Chauvin, but if they convict on manslaughter, that will be a slap in the face for this community because the punishment simply will not fit the crime.
Former prosecutor David Henderson, thank you so much for being on this morning, and still ahead on Morning